Great, welcome everybody. I'm Rob Bennett, founder CEO of Eco Districts. Great to have you all with us the week before Thanksgiving for our Wednesday webinar series for November, where I'm very excited to be joined by two colleagues that I've had the chance to work with quite a bit over the last few years. Nella Young, Megan Venerable-Thomas of Enterprise. And Enterprise has been a great partner and thought leader and participant and contributor to the Eco Districts efforts since the day we were founded in 2013. So I've always been very appreciative of the work of Enterprise as a national intermediary, advancing excellence in community development and affordable housing, and the role that specifically that Megan and Nella have played in participating in our work. We're going to talk today about this notion of centering culture and healing in community development and moving beyond a lot of the metrics and work that traditionally is part of affordable housing, building units of housing, housing people, making sure they have the kind of services and support and dignity that is a fundamental need for us in society and housing those, particularly those most vulnerable. This is the work of affordable housing providers. This is the work of Enterprise as an intermediary to support affordable housing. But the work that Megan and Nella have done specifically in Enterprise is really to move beyond the issues around design and the issues of sort of execution and financing of affordable housing, but really thinking about community designed decision-making, participatory processes to integrate these issues of culture, of healing, of health, of design in a more integrative fashion. So the work that they do in the design center and the colleagues that Megan and Nella have worked with over the years is very much in the spirit of the work that Eco Districts advances. So we're going to get into it in just a couple minutes. For those of you who are not familiar with webinars, which I'm assuming is very few of you at this point, we're all getting quite used to this virtual world. We have both a Q&A function and a chat function in Zoom that you can start to post questions as Nella and Megan present. We're going to have time at the end, and I'll do my best to look at those questions and consolidate some of those questions to make sure we get as much conversation as we can. Of course, this is just an hour, but Megan and Nella, I'm sure, would be available to follow up for those of you who have more questions about their work. I want to thank our sponsors, as you can see here, Nella and Megan, and I'll talk a little bit about their bio in just a minute. Thank our sponsors at JPB Foundation and Kresge Foundation. They've been long-term supporters of Eco Districts and helped make our accreditation program and our programs generally go. Nella and Megan are really interesting, and both of them have very different backgrounds, and I know they work together. I've seen them present. They've been part of our faculty at Eco Districts. Megan has a doctorate in public health. She's a former cadet, graduate of West Point in the Army, and has done a lot of work around trauma and health and healing people in her work, and has sort of come to Enterprise with a really interesting lens around the needs of people and how they sort of interact both with their communities, but also in housing, the work that Enterprise does. And Nella comes out of experiential learning and urban planning to work on, and has been working on the issues of placemaking and food security, among other things. So they both have this very interesting set of backgrounds, and they've been working together to advance these issues around culture and healing and community development. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Megan and Nella to take it away for us.
Thanks, Rob. If you want to pull up that first slide, we're here talking today about centering culture and healing in community development, and we're going to dig a little bit deep into that today. So first, just wanted to show you an agenda of what we'll be talking about today. We're going to do a little welcome. in the spirit of healing-centered practice, we're going to ground ourselves a little bit in this space together. And then we're going to get into, what are we even talking about? And how did we get here? And then we'll get into a framework, the framework that we've been developing around what healing-centered approach to community development looks like, that provides us some strategies and practices, and dig a little bit deeper into what those practices are, and then kick it back to all of you, hopefully, for some discussion to see how this resonates with you and where this is landing for you in your work. So first, just to start, we're going to first start with a land acknowledgement, and it's really just to, I think, align us with where we are in our different places across the globe, and to center us in this space together. So, first, I'm here with you today in Native space and on traditional lands of the Massachusetts tribe. I'm speaking as a Black woman, descendant of slaves, who were stolen from their land to come and work the soil of this land for centuries before them, that was stewarded and cultivated and loved by Native people. Here in Massachusetts, which retains the name of the people who lived here and who always have, we all invoke and acknowledge Native space each time we hear, we state, we read, or we write the name of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So think about what that is for your state or wherever you're coming through, that might also invoke some of the people who have been there before and who still live there. And in honoring the land means honoring everything that we're a part of. It acknowledges our inseparable connectedness, which we'll talk a little bit more about, with everything else in the world. And it acknowledges that all we do have an effect on everything else. So in honor of all living things that share the space with us, I honor the ancestors that came before me and those that will come after me. And I ask us to remember that wherever you are in America, you are in Native space, and that there are Indigenous people that belong to that place. So may all we do in Native spaces both honor the land and prepare the way for those to come. And just for a moment, maybe just starting to take a few deep breaths in this space that you are in through the nose and maybe out through the mouth. Just noticing any sounds, colors, if it's warm, if it's cool. And maybe on your next exhale, softly closing your eyes or shifting your gaze down, coming into the breath. Just noticing the inhale. Can you be aware of the full inhale? Can you be aware of the full exhale? Can you notice the quality of that breath as it goes in and out? Can you notice where that breath lands in the body, maybe in the chest or the belly or the nostrils? Just following that breath where it feels easy. And maybe bringing some awareness to the soles of the feet, just feeling them ground down onto whatever surface they're connected to. Just noticing, not changing anything. And maybe bringing awareness to your seat, feeling the weight of your body, wherever you're sitting, wherever you're landing, feeling firm in this place. And maybe bringing attention to the palms of the hands, wherever they're landing, whatever surface they're touching. Maybe feeling the pulsing of the blood through the veins. And maybe bringing awareness to the face, just noticing. And then coming back to that breath, in through the nose and out through the mouth, knowing that throughout this conversation, throughout this day, that we always have this breath or this body or these sounds to come back to if we need a moment to recall who we are and how we are connected. And maybe on that next exhale, just allowing those eyes to softly open, bringing us into this space, feeling present and prepared for a beautiful conversation. Thank you all for indulging me. Um, and I hope that this can get us kicked off to really think about what some of these practices and processes and strategies really help to connect us to in our work and how we bring those more abundantly together.
Thank you, Megan. So I am really excited to be here. I am Nella, and I am speaking to you also from Massachusetts, and really grateful for the land acknowledgement that Megan shared. And also, before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that a lot of what we are talking about is what we've been hearing in all of the eco districts sessions, I think, really consistently. From Amaka back in June, Julian, Kofi, Tamika, all of us are really talking about maybe using some slightly different words, but really talking a lot about the same thing. And so I just want to acknowledge how there's a moment right now that I think we're all entering and gathering our resources for how we're going to head into the future together, and gathering our people. So it's really wonderful to be here together with you and to share a little bit about some of the words and the framing that we're using in our work. So I thought I would begin by sharing a story that's helped us to ground this work and helped me to understand what a healing-centered approach looks like and why it's so important. A couple of summers ago, Megan and I went to Duluth and we visited Jamaji. This is a place in Duluth that is home to 29 families, as well as a cultural center, a child care center, an art gallery, and shop. And it is owned and managed by ACO, which is the American Indian Community Housing Organization. Jamaji is short for Jamaji Mino Bimadizian, which is an Ojibwe phrase that means we are all of us together beginning a good life. In our conversations with the residents and the network of partners at ACO, people emphasized to us not only the traumatic history of tribal communities, but also the rich culture that it is part of how they have survived despite these generations of trauma. And they also talked about the impact of having the current narrative of their community be a negative one, because the visibility of the Native community in Duluth is often around homelessness and poverty. So the Jamaji building is very visible when you enter town, and they made a decision to harness that and broadcast a positive identity of the Native community in Duluth and in the region. In this case, the identity of the water protector. So they had a whole process behind how they did this. They convened a cultural and climate resilience advisory committee, including residents and local knowledge holders. And that included selecting a muralist for this artwork of the water protector that you see here on the wall that's so visible when you enter town. And this is the first public artwork in Duluth representing the Native community that was created by a Native artist. And that's just one piece of the story, a much bigger story of how ACO has centered culture in how they address food security, and how they've made their cultural center into a resilience hub. And they've extended their participation and reach into environmental circles at the city level. So this is just a small glimpse of what centering culture and healing can look like in practice. And I will share, I can share some links as well to further information if you want to learn more about ACO. But I tell this story because it's just one example of how across the country, when we've had these conversations, we hear stories of individual, collective, and intergenerational trauma. And it's deeply connected in the housing communities where we work. And also with these always come stories of culture and healing. So these facts about our history and traumas and present reality are not new. And although the data exists and although truth has been told again and again, I think that we can agree 2020 is one more wake-up call, whether we're dealing with a natural disaster, a pandemic, violence, or economic challenges. We cannot deny that racism is a root cause of why Black, Indigenous, and people of color face disproportionate trauma and adverse outcomes due to all of these challenges, many of which we're all facing all at once this year. So faced with this complex yet unmistakable reality, we're all asking what is needed. And a clear response that we have heard over the years and now, and from people across the spectrum, is that healing is needed. So I am very lucky to have amazing colleagues in this work from whom I learn every day, including Dr. Megan Venable-Thomas, and she's going to take us into our healing-centered framework. And I just want to say before I pass it to Megan that, you know, Megan and our team, Brandon, Chandra, Jody, and others, have not only shared their wisdom and expertise and brought it to bear in this framework, they also have challenged me and called me into what it means to center healing, to center liberation, and why that also means centering Blackness unapologetically, which as a white woman, I am clear that centering Blackness is the work that I need to be doing. And I'm really only just beginning to learn. And one of the gifts is the gift of being able to make mistakes as I go, in deep partnership with colleagues whom I care about a lot. And I'm glad to have care about me, because I have no question that the benefits extend to society as a whole, which includes me not only in the long term, but right now, because this is what this moment calls for, and it's time to embrace it. So the healing-centered framework provides some guidance for us on how to do this, and I am glad to pass it to Megan to walk us through it.
Thank you, Nella, for that powerful example. But also such a clear demonstration of how healing is about relationship building, and really what we need here is about relationship. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the healing-centered community development frame, but first, also to talk a little bit about what does healing even mean. And, you know, in the public health field, we talk a lot about health, and healing and health are similar, but they're not the same. Healing is really a verb that refers to the process of restoring health. And just as the definition of health is very multidimensional, the range of healing processes is equally broad, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But healing can refer to the physiological processes that mend injury, and also the emotional and spiritual and psychological processes that relieve stress, achieve acceptance, promote hope, and restore relationships. And healing is really about taking action. It includes the body's repairing mechanisms, the behaviors you engage in that positively influence your health, as well as the interventions of community-based practitioners and how we engage with one another, like compensating people for their time, investing in community priorities, enforcing fair housing laws, but also by using creative and inclusive processes that prioritize resident voices and integrate culture. If you go to the next slide, which really lifts up a main theme, or by designing buildings and places that connect and protect people, and or by creating structures for resident leadership in decision-making and shifting power. These all really contribute positively to the health and well-being of residents and neighborhoods. And as Nella was saying, we're all living through several crises of our time, our generations, through this pandemic, through the housing crisis, which affects many of us and our work. And as many folks are realizing for the first time, the persistent impact of racism. When we understand that these crises produce trauma we're all living through, we recognize that trauma is collective, and thus our healing responses must also be collective. This is the most pressing work. So while health is an outcome, healing is a choice, and one we all can make in our daily lives, whether in our work or in our home life. Next slide, please. So what is a healing-centered approach for community development? Simply put, it is ways for us to practice being in right relationship with ourselves and each other, and much like Adrienne Maree Brown's emergent strategy says, practice the ways to intentionally change or grow our capacity to embody the just and liberated world that we long for. And so it's a strength-based approach that advances a holistic view of healing and recenters culture and identity as central feature in well-being. It incorporates plans of action, personal practices, organizing tools that really are helping us to think about the critical process of repairing and restoring relationships for equitable development. So in the study and practice of healing-centered strategy, we've created core principles that we've seen emerge through our conversations and our work that help guide us in learning and using this idea and method in the world. And there are key strategies that are our plans for actualizing these principles, and then practices, which are our methods for achieving these goals or action steps. And we gather them here with the expectation that they will grow as we continue to converse in community and have conversations that feel good and adapt this work. And so, I kind of talked about these really large themes of culture, connection, and power that we see as a part of this work. But these principles around, one, that culture builds connection. There are many definitions for culture. One that's most resonant to me is that culture is the way of life of a group of people. And this can include traditions and practices and stories. But these tools have healing qualities in that they help us make connections with ourselves, to feel a sense of belonging, and to strengthen a sense of identity and purpose. And what we know and have seen through our work, and that is evident particularly right now in the pandemic for many of us, is that communities most likely to survive and thrive in the face of disaster are not just structurally sound, right? The buildings aren't just strong or the bridges aren't just well connected, but that they are socially connected. Right, that folks also have a level of connection to one another. And it's not just necessary for feeling a sense of belonging, but it actively pushes back against isolation, which is another increasingly harmful health outcome that we've been seeing a lot more of right now, that's actually been demonstrated to be more detrimental than smoking a pack of cigarettes a day to your health. And so on the individual level, it lets us know we aren't alone. And on a community level, it connects us with the networks and the capacity for support that understands our needs and that we feel we can trust. So a healing-centered approach uses culture as a way to ground in a solid sense of meaning, self-perception, and purpose, and really highlights the intersectional nature of identity in the ways in which culture offers shared experience, community, and belonging. And then collective strengths create capacity. So often when thinking of capacity building, we first identify the challenges, right? What isn't working? This is often how we view trauma. We think about what has caused the trauma and how do we fix it. However, if we understand that trauma is experienced collectively, then we know that healing is as well. And the fact that communities who have experienced historic and generational exclusion and oppression exist today is a demonstration of the many assets of those communities, right? And when we shift to an approach that is asset-driven, that focuses on the well-being we want, rather than the symptoms we want to suppress, we actually build the capacity of folks to be able to imagine something different, whether it be a home, a school, or a community. And so when we think about capacity building as opposed to technical assistance, how is it really lifting up the existing tools and assets that are already well deep in community? Next, relationship building is a measure of our resilience. So if we understand that, I think Audre Lorde talks about the goal of racism is to distract us from our work. If we know that this thing is about breaking down relationships, disconnecting people, then we know that our intervention is about relationship building. And really, as we're able to do that more effectively and efficiently, we're actually able to better bounce back from these disasters that we're experiencing time and time again, and that certain communities are disproportionately experiencing over and over again at a disparate rate. Then what we pay attention to grows, right? And what we invest in thrives, which is the other part of that principle. And so it's not enough. It's one thing to pay attention. When we really start to think about what our goal is in this work, and if we're not thinking about responding to racism, about relationship building, about connection, then we might be missing inadvertently the true power of what we have to do and where our resources are going, right? So when we identify who actually needs more support, we focus our investments there, and we see that what we pay attention to can actually grow and shift power. And then interdependence shifts power. So interdependence is really defined as the mutual dependence between things. I think our kind of Euro-American society is very strongly based on a culture of individualism. And what we learned from many of our Native and Indigenous communities across the globe is that we are, again, all really connected. And when we recognize that and we push back against what racism tells us, which is the disconnection of people based on the color of their skin, right? When we recognize we need to repair that, we recognize how connected we are, then it helps us to recognize and empathize with other folks' experience and truly identify the ways in which we are investing in those people, in those communities, in those businesses that have historically disproportionately experienced the brunt of our disinvestment. And that really shifts power from who's at the table to make decisions to what organizations we're investing in and how we're growing them. And I think that's a really important shift. And to Nella's point about why time and time again, it comes back to how are we centering Blackness? How are we centering, right, the folks that we have disproportionately disadvantaged? How are we centering those folks, which may look different in your own community, but ultimately in this country looks like very specific? How are we centering that? How are we shifting that? And that's really how we're shifting power. And so ultimately our strategies are really around, one, reflecting. So acknowledging that, right, when we think about decolonizing any system, we also have to start with decolonizing ourselves, right? What are the things we've internalized? What are the biases that we hold? What are the ways in which we understand the world and even the need for these things? So it takes a level of reflection and acknowledgement that helps us to show up in community as community developers or practitioners in a way that actually is healing. Second, involve. We need to be able to assess and honor the inherent strengths. So how are we thinking about, right, those collective strengths? Again, who gets to decide what those are? How do we understand what those are? And how do we get involved? Restore. How are we creating spaces for healing? Understanding, as Audre Lorde said, that rest is resistance. It is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. And so how are we actively engaging in restoration as part of the necessary component to being able to work and show up in this work time and time again? Investment, as we talked about, building community power. What do our investments look like? How are we shifting those from what we traditionally do into those that are actually making the impact that gets us to the goal of healing, of overcoming trauma, of Black liberation, whatever our goals are, and then reimagining. So this takes some creative work, y'all. We spent a lot of time and hundreds of years working on the institutions and the systems of racism, the isms, you know, and so it's going to take some real creativity for us to be able to think about the out of the box. We work with a colleague, April D. Simone, who works with who has an organization called Designing the We. And she always talks about how before we even start to design, we have to undesign. You know, that takes some creativity to be able to advance liberation. And again, to even give us the capacity to start imagining things differently, how these strategies work in concert with one another to give us the capacity to do what we need to do. And so there are many practices out there for what healing looks like. As Nella was saying, like healing looks different for everyone. And so we got to reach down into our toolkits. We got to talk to folks. We got to lift. I mean, much of what we do, we know. How are you healing yourself currently? And how are those practices brought more fully, right, into our work? How are we listening and hearing each other? And so we have a collection of things, of practitioners that we've learned from ourselves, but also some inventory work that we do with ourselves to understand what those tools are. And so we have some things that we're developing too to help us do more of that self-reflection. And so Nella's going to go a little bit deeper into a few of our practices and how they align with these principles and these strategies.
Thanks, Megan. So this is what people always ask when we talk about this. Everyone's really eager to know, but what does it look like, and how can I do this? And there are a lot of layers. It's not simple. And I will also say that my personal how-to guide is going to be different from yours. So we've just worked to generate some useful guidance for thinking through these principles and then unpacking them a little bit. Especially what I'm going to talk about is the context of a project that you might be working on in a specific place, like a building you may be building. And one thing that I have learned is that the more striving and searching that I have done for a rule book or a formula that I can follow, which I constantly crave, and I'm sure others do too, but the more I've done that, the more I've learned that the essential tool is to enter a situation or a conversation. Instead of feeling I have to have the answer, the tool is to enter with a question. And so this healing-centered lens for projects provides a series of initial questions that are aligned with the core principles of the framework and that can guide you to live up to the intention to center local culture, connection, and power in a project. So starting with this overarching question for culture, how might this project promote healing and reflect a definition of health that is inclusive of cultural identity, social determinants of health, and mental and physical well-being? For connection, how might this project celebrate community strengths and assets, strengthen relationships and connections, and mitigate displacement and loss of diversity and culture? And for power, how might this project prioritize people as much as buildings? And then each of these core prompts leads to more prompts and questions that align with the various strategies that Megan presented. So for culture, asking about the narrative, the process, and the space. And I'm going to go through this really quickly. It's just sort of an illustration, but it's a way of seeing how we kind of go through a sequence of questions nested inside questions. So looking at, for connection, building awareness, connecting with existing assets, and increasing social cohesion. And for power, supporting resident leadership, optimizing for positive, optimizing for positive multiple impacts, and making co-creation the way you work. So this suite of nested questions and practices is a great tool because you can bring it to a lot of contexts, and from it emerge a number of practices that you can employ. So just two of these practices that I'm going to highlight are practices we developed in partnership with an advisory group as we developed the Green Communities criteria for enterprise and its 2020 update. So one of them is convening a community advisory group, and the other is doing cultural asset mapping. And those are both things that ACO was doing, and the example I was giving earlier. So this is like a nesting doll. For these practices, they work with some of the core questions presented in that healing-centered lens. And then there are these in-depth tools that go a level deeper and provide descriptiveness if you want it. So just a quick snapshot of the cultural advisory group drawing on those questions and guides that I highlighted before, and similar for cultural asset mapping. And then there are templates available on our website, and I will paste this into the chat, that are even more detailed guidance that walks you through an approach to doing this. It's not the only way, and a lot of people have done amazing creative examples of this, but it gives you, for those who feel like they need a starting point, it gives more prescriptive guidance. So these tools really provide an entry point for how to integrate community and resident participation and leadership, so that the built environment, as well as the processes and the programs that we're designing, by honoring cultural identities, resident voices, and community histories, provide not only health, but healing. So we would love to enter discussion with you all now. I don't know if there are any final thoughts that Megan or Rob want to share, but one of the things we would really be curious to hear from the group on the line is about, as we've shared this framework, how does it apply to the work that you do, and what are some of the connections that it has raised for you?
Thank you, Nell. Thank you, Megan. Megan, are there any final sort of observations or reflections on the, or should we jump into Q&A?
No, yeah, I would say, as I was saying at the beginning, this is, I think, something that we are growing, and really a concept that's not new, that a lot of people are practicing. And I think what we've heard time and time again too is that, like, so many people have the tools they've been using on the ground. The fact that, right, indigenous communities, that descendants of slaves exist is a testament to the resilience of our community and our ability to employ tools for healing, that we have used time and time again, and why culture is such an important component of this. And I think this does speak to, what tools people hold within themselves, what's in their community and the land, our connection to plants and animals, and just bringing in a more holistic ideal about how we think about community development, and affirming, I think, that healing and restoration do not just have to be what you do and reach for outside of your work, like what you do when you get home, or when you try to go, meditate for 5 minutes or whatever. How do we bring those things more closely together? How are they prioritized within our organizations and our industries? And how are those lifted up as really the work that we need to be doing and focusing on?
Thank you both. What I want to start with, I think, a fundamental question, which I imagine you get a lot, and it's part of the Q&A that's coming over from the presentation, and that is the sort of practical nature of those who are, who execute affordable housing, and those who are, who have the not so easy task of designing and constructing and ultimately maintaining and managing buildings. What you're doing is really, intersectional around the people who live and the people ultimately who manage and develop these projects. You started with a story from Duluth. What are you seeing, from the community development industry, both those who are kind of provide the support, the financing, the sort of technical skills, and those who are in the community development spaces themselves, who are the leaders locally? How are they, how are they embracing this work? How are they sort of overcoming some of the inertia of we're in the housing production business, and that's where our focus is. And so, talk a little bit about that, but then also talk sort of fundamentally about what kind of resources are required for the kind of, pre-development and this kind of, important organizing assessment work that the framework calls for.
I would start by saying it's a challenge. I think that's the real answer, is that there are certain incentives in our systems and in our governance structures and in our rule books that don't prioritize this, right? Like, and that do prioritize getting the building made, following the timeline. And so, I think it is often a conversation about why should we be doing this? And for folks who want to do it, right? How can they have the capacity to grow that? And I think that's really where organizations like Enterprise come into practice with, how are we getting some of the two criteria, or the two components that Nella brought forward are parts of the Green Communities criteria. So they are in 32 QAPs across the country for new market tax credits for building affordable housing. And so, we are trying to think about, how do we make this more readily available, and whose responsibility it is to do that? Because what we're finding, even internally, we've been having these conversations around relationship building and how we are able to relate to one another, even as coworkers. And what has come up time and time again is people's desire for something that is more healing centered, something that is more focused on how do we build trust in this given context. Because I think folks recognize, if you've been doing this work for a while, that distrust exists, and with good reason. And so how do we start to even have the conversations about what we want to do differently, and how that's actually necessary to be shifting our practice? But I think the first step is people wanting to do more equitable development, and that being a priority, because it's a really hard conversation if you don't even have the baseline. And so we're really trying to come at it at many different angles around, like, policy, how we make certain things a requirement, but also how we shift people's thinking around what is most important.
And I will add just a note that it feels really big. And like Megan said, it helps if you want to try. But we've seen even somewhat skeptical and hesitant groups do small things and then learn from it. So one group we worked with several years back with a very small grant program, the Collaborative Action Grants, was a group in LA, and they did a small event that they hosted on the site of a future development, and they engaged with neighbors and asked people what they wanted to see there and what their neighborhood was like. And afterwards, even though people were like, what's the point of this? In the end, even the executive director acknowledged that it removed so much of the antagonism from the public engagement process that, they're always bracing against. And it made it much easier to imagine a project that could respond to community needs without being a battle. And in the end, when we worked on developing the criteria for green communities, which is now in all these QAPs, like Megan said, and is part of the low-income housing tax credit financing system, the advisory group also reminded us, this streamlines your process, this streamlines approvals, this increases occupancy rates, this decreases vacancy rates, that there is some rationale in that criterion that is very much about the short-term kind of like dollars and timeline issues that do drive a lot of development. So even in that context, this is not only possible, but also can help you.
I want to pick up on some of the questions around power. and particularly some examples you can share about that shifting power and how does that sort of manifest? You know, at Eco Districts, we're fellow travelers in this space. We really are interested in new forms of community-driven development that ultimately ownership and power shifts. But that requires governance. It requires decision-making. It requires nuance around political and relationships between property managers, for instance, in housing and tenants. Can you talk a little bit about some examples where you've seen a demonstrable shift in power? What's it look like? What did it take to get there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was looking at one of the questions also talking about paying people. You know, I think oftentimes we're asking community members or residents to volunteer their time to give us input on our development projects or processes. And I think, right, like how we actually demonstrate value is paying people for their time, knowing that their time is valuable and actually adding them to the process. So it's not just about me asking you for some of your input that I may take or leave, but how do we actually create a governance structure that is an integral part of how we're going to do the process of pre-development and design, and engage the community as real partners in this work. And so I think we've seen in ACO where they made an actual cultural advisory group where folks were paid to give their input as cultural bearers in their community, what they wanted to see in the development and design of this new building and what was going to happen on the top of it, which was the solar panels, which was the mural, but also a huge community garden as one of the things that they struggled with there being food insecurity. And so, you know, how is it not just my input and I give it when I can, when people are already probably at capacity and stretched doing their normal business work, but how are they actually being paid and how is their input being valued? In addition to, they hired someone from the community and they valued that person's experience in community as expertise for this job. And so I think also, like, how are we valuing people's experience as expertise, their lived experience as knowledge for resident expertise that gives me information on this project? And I think some of those things are like simple things, but are things that really shift our relationship to the work and community.
Great, thank you. God, there's so many questions here. I'm having a hard time catching up with them all. There's a question kind of about the, I guess, the tension or the, you know, potential conflict with sort of autonomy of artists' ability to do work and kind of shared power and decision making. Any experience there on the sort of, you know, the issues of autonomy and freedom and sort of expression of art that you're really sort of pulling into these projects and what that means for sort of the broader community of residents or community development organizations.
Nellie, you want to talk about?
Sure, I'll start. It's a really good question, and it's a question that I think a lot of people are thinking about, a lot of artists and community developers think about. And it takes certain kinds of artists to want to enter into this kind of practice. I think about how so many of the artists that we've partnered with through the Rose Fellowship and others who were part of our cultural advisory group have demonstrated their not only talent as and artistic excellence, but also their facilitation skills and their ability to hold a space that allows for this kind of co-creation. And I think about One of the people in our advisory group was Ashley Hansen, who worked with Southwest Minnesota Housing Partnership, and she worked with community members. She's worked in several rural communities around Minnesota, about telling the story of the history of the place. And she hosts circles, and the community generates the story, and she kind of produces or pulls it all together, and then the community also performs the story. And so she has this amazing talent as a sort of facilitator, creating healing spaces, creating generative spaces, and then also creating, like, directing, writing and directing a production that really harnesses the story and even harnesses people in telling that story too. And so it's an amazing skill set. And I could go on with examples, but we've seen our Rose Fellows, our Artist Rose Fellows, have a really broad range of skills as performing artists, cultural organizers. And we have a commercial illustrator. She has a background as a commercial illustrator, using that as a way of translating community voice. And so there are a lot of ways, which is like an entire other webinar probably, about the ways in which we're seeing how artists are able to do this. And I think that they also hold those questions about aesthetics and excellence as well, but it's one of the kind of dynamic tensions at the heart of this, of the best work, actually, I think.
And I feel like, to add to that, this fellowship program that we have at Enterprise pays artists to be part of a community development framework. They work for community development corporations. So, they are integrated into the process of how we do this work. That really helps you to very intentionally think about, what does creativity look like? How do we really pull at all the creative tools that we have to reimagine what this neighborhood can do, reimagine how folks' culture and identity is lifted up, reimagine how we talk and communicate with one another. And I think that that is critically important. And we've been having a lot of conversations with one of our organizations that we work with at the Punta Urban Art Museum in Salem, about, what artists we lift up matters too. Like, are they representative of this community? Whose voices are lifted up, and whose voices are lifted up as translators in this community. And I think that that's equally important. Like, we want to lift up, obviously, the Banksys of the world that make a beautiful art, but there are also folks who are, maybe you don't lift up Banksy because we don't know who they are, but but also, there are beautiful, amazing artists in your community whose support could be really useful in the process and thinking about the process.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out, for those of you, there's some great conversations on the chat and the Q&A, and thank you to Emmanuel Herbert, who is highlighting some resources, including the Montreal-based mural producer MU. So I encourage you to look at that. That's in the chat function. So thank you. That seems very aligned with the work that Megan and Noah are talking about. So there's a couple questions and maybe we'll sort of end here. We only have 6 minutes, but in the areas of sort of definitions and success factors, and this is, as I think Noah pointed out, this is sort of, this is complex, nested doll layer work. Talk a little bit about, see if I can sort of connect the dots on how do you measure success, so kind of a metrics-based question, and how do you define community? This is tricky territory. We know in community development, many voices represent sort of individual issues often. So talk a little bit about that definition of community, if you can, and sort of metrics of success in the work that you've advanced with this framework.
Yeah, I feel like the metrics of success is just like the question that all the funders want to know. Like, what is it? You know, how do we measure it? And obviously, you know, in my background, metrics and indicators are part of my educational practice. But I actually have grown to believe that sometimes when we focus so much on the metrics, we lose sight of, right, they are a barrier, again, to actually doing the work that is like relationship building, that is trust building, that is, I think I saw someone with a really cool question in here about the conversation with Adrienne Marie Brown last night, Alexandria, about like, what is more than compelling than hate? You know, how do we think about that in our work? And I think these are some of the questions that when we get so encumbered by the metrics, we really lose sight of our ability to do the work. Not to say that metrics aren't important, because I do think how we're thinking about this work is better off measures, right? Who is better off by us doing this work, and what does that look like, right? And if Black and brown communities are not better off by this work, then we're missing the mark. And I think, you know, as a national organization, again, we understand that context and connection and community all looks different. Place matters. And so for us at a national level to decide broad sweeping better off measures and metrics is really a challenge, and one that I feel like is not so feasible. And so, you know, we have a bunch of indicators that we could look at based on census tract data, and we can measure, has asthma expression decreased, or, you know, is hypertension gone down in certain communities. But it's like, is that really what is getting at what we're saying we're trying to do in this work? And I think that the better off measures, my background is in qualitative research as well, so it's also, you know, how are we making people feel, right? How do people feel different? How are their relationships different? And maybe how does that impact our ability to build a more beautiful building that people respond to, or have more developments here or there? But I think so much of our indicators and metrics that are expressed at a level that we can collect easily are undergirded by many of the things that are problematic in our system. And so we really have been trying to rethink, what does that look like? And how do we think about better off measures at the community level? And I don't know, Nell, if you want to talk about community and what that means, but I think it means a lot of different things. And so definitions are also hard.
Yeah, I mean, we have also a nested definition of community, because we know that in order to do this work, we need to start with ourselves. And so we can't insist that others need to do this if we cannot model it ourselves on doing that, and figuring out how to do that more comprehensively in our organization. So we start as close as ourselves. We talk about the practitioners that we work with. I think the affordable housing delivery system, we talk about centering resident voices, and yet one of the most important kind of connectors or links in that system is the community development practitioners, and how we center their ability to enter community, be with community, listen, and then navigate these systems, which are often driven by finance and time issues. And so this question of who are you accountable to is not a simple one. And it's a really important one, because that's often whose metrics we're answering to. And so an ideal, which I don't know, I'm sure it's been done, and there are probably good examples maybe from the community science field, but you know, an ideal is that we're not only co-creating the vision for what we want to see with communities, but communities are defining the metrics. What does success actually look like? And then deciding how that will be determined. And in our Green Communities criteria, we actually link to some resources for how to do that. And it's been done in global humanitarian contexts, probably more than it has been done in community development, but there is a model for doing it and a number of tools for how you then conduct that evaluation. So it's possible. And it's aspirational probably for our field right now, but I don't think it's impossible to achieve.
Well, I think we're gonna leave it at that. We're at the noon hour, and we know everyone's busy, and this is sort of extracurricular for some. But this has been such a terrific hour. Tremendous feedback coming from the chat and the Q&A. Thanking both Megan and Nella for their wisdom and time. I would say, you know, it's so important for us to recognize the power of just expressing this in community development and the frameworks that these two have worked on, activating and elevating issues of Blackness and anti-racism in community development, which to some has been their life's work, and for others it's just the start of their career and trying to figure out this in a much more expressive and much more clear way. So when we started Eco Districts, this is exactly the kind of intersectional work that we were trying to elevate by making equity, resilience, and climate action fundamental to community development. And the fact that these two powerful women are part of that journey of making community development sort of center in health and healing, and is just great. So thank you to the framework. You know, there's more questions. The framework is online, I believe, and Teva will follow up with everyone who's online with this presentation recorded and the resources. If you want to reach out, I know Megan and Elle would be happy to sort of talk with you. Again, thank you to the two of you. I know you're busy. As always, we really appreciate your time with Eco Districts and the Eco Districts community. Thanks very much, and have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for all the questions. So sorry we couldn't get to all of them. They were such good questions. But we'll take all these questions back. Teva, can we get all these questions? Because I think this helps us too.
I can send you the exported list of all of the questions.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.